faster than a speeding bullet,
I ran until my muscles burned and my veins pumped battery acid.
more powerful than a locomotive.
An idea is like a virus, resilient, highly contagious.
Able to leap tall buildings in a single bound.
Hey guys, Jared Moon here, and welcome to the Better Humanology podcast. Now we have a pretty awesome interview today, and we're going to get straight to it, but today I want to do something that I don't normally do, and I'm going to just read Dr. Sherlin's bio. I don't normally read the bio, but I really feel that anyone listening needs to get the full depth, the full view of what Dr. Sherlin is into, and just kind of the magnitude of or caliber of human being we have on the podcast. A guy I was fortunate enough to be able to interview. So I'm going to read his bio, and then we're just going to hop straight into the episode. But before we do that, I do want to say, if you're enjoying the Better Humanology podcast, the challenges, the mental toughness challenges, the book recommendations, the fitness challenges, all of those things, and the interviews, and all of the things that we're doing, if you're enjoying that, please head over to iTunes, leave us a 5-star review and a positive comment. Really helps us push the show out to more people and get more ears listening. And so I'd really appreciate that if you guys could take the 10 seconds to do that. But I won't delay any further. Let me read this bio, and then we will hop into the interview. So Dr. Leslie Sherlin studies the brains of people making decisions, very good decisions. He's one of the world's leading experts on the neuroscience of high performance, having spent his career pursuing the answer to one simple question. Why is one person so naturally gifted while others try so much harder only to fall short? Music, math, sports, some have a knack while the rest of us struggle. 20 years, 4 universities, and 35,000 EEGs later, Sherlin has found his answer in the electrical patterns of the brain. Sherlin has founded a number of different companies and holds 4 academic appointments. Among them, he is the co-founder and chief executive and science officer of Sensei Labs, a leader in the research and use of neuroscience for improving human performance. Sherlin has led Sensei Labs research partnerships with Red Bull's High Performance Center, USA Track and Field, U.S. Military Special Operations Forces, and more to discover what the brains of the most high-performing people were doing and help them to do more of it. Dr. Sherlin's work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, BBC, Sports Illustrated, CNN, ESPN, CBS, Popular Science, Outdoor Magazine, and more. He is also a sought-after public speaker with hundreds of hours on stage around the world. He continues to keep his hands in the trenches, providing sport and performance consulting and brain training services to individuals and teams. Dr. Sherlin is listed in the United States Olympic Committee's Sports Psychology and Mental Training Registry, and he's a certified consultant by the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. I read all of that. I don't normally like to read an entire bio because I feel like they can be a bit dry, but I wanted to read this because the people he's worked with, the organizations he's worked with, the places he's been featured, his study, his research alone, it's all worth mentioning, and I think it sets you up really well and gives you a good understanding of who we're talking to before we dive into it. So now that you know, let's do that. Here is Dr. Leslie Sherlin. All right, Dr. Sherlin. First, I want to say thank you so much for being on the Better Humanology podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this today.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and so we hit the ground running when we start our podcast, and we go, since these are published on Monday, we like to give the listeners, a really good start to the week by giving them some challenges that they can take on. It doesn't have to be immediate, but, something they can work on throughout the week or over the course of a few months. And so when we bring someone on, I like to get their opinion, and our 3 topics are fitness, mental toughness, and a book recommendation. If we could start by you giving me and all of the listeners a fitness or physical challenge.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've seen work both in my own life, but also with many others, both with clients who are athletes as well as other types of domains, is an endurance fitness challenge. And so if you have the bandwidth to take it on for a longer time frame, picking either cycling or running and really setting an aspirational goal that might be like 6 or 8 months, 9 months worth of training to achieve, whether that's a half marathon, a marathon, or a century bike ride or a half century. But even if you don't have that kind of long-term aspiration for it, then just setting up, pushing yourself, challenging yourself within, this week, perhaps to set an hour or 2 hour endurance type of activity, whether it's a walk, run, or whatever your physical capacity is at the time. But from a physical standpoint, and building into that mental toughness, that growth from a mental side of it, putting ourselves in endurance types of situations are things that tax our body, but they don't really put us in danger of, of real physical harm, but cause us to have to really dig deep, both from that physical pain threshold, but from the mental side of it as well. So fighting through the temptation to stop and building that confidence along the way, that's where we really create this idea that we often talk about of like grit or resiliency. And so I just say, embrace the challenge, and while doing it, realize that resilience only comes from being challenged. And so this is how we get better. And so push yourself in an endurance kind of a way, extending a workout or going for a couple of hours, or maybe setting a longer term goal, I think is really a powerful thing from a physical and a mental standpoint.
Awesome. Yeah, that's kind of funny because I'm primarily a barbell guy, and I do a lot of high intensity training and lifting. But when I want to push myself, I always opt for an endurance event. So either a longer run or a cycle or something, because it gets me way outside my comfort zone. And I love that was your recommendation. So is that both the fitness and mental toughness challenge?
Yeah, so that's the both of those things go together. And just to add a little bit of context onto the mental challenge, I would say being mindful about it. And if that word means something very intense to you, then you know exactly what to do. If that's a concept that you only have heard of, then just going into it without any judgment about your performance and just being completely aware of the experience, focusing on just the experience of doing it. So don't really beat yourself up on setting a specific distance goal or a time, or this isn't about breaking records. It's about pushing yourself to get as a process, and being mindful in that is just taking in the whole experience about how your body feels, what's your emotional context of it, what's it smell like outside, and what's the texture of the road or the terrain that you're running or cycling on. Just really being in that moment. That's the mental side of it, and it'll really enhance the experience.
Awesome. And how about a book recommendation?
Yeah, so I've got two, and it kind of depends on where people fall on the spectrum of looking for something that's kind of aspirational versus something that might really challenge you in a new way. There's two books that I read, and I like to spread myself across lots of different things. And one of them that I'm just getting into a good bit and so far am really enjoying is a book by Amy Cuddy, that's Cuddy, and it's called Presence: Bringing Your Boldest Self to Your Biggest Challenges. And again, I'm just getting into that, but it's really an inspirational kind of a story. It's talking about lots of different people who kind of find themselves in stressful situations, and we learn how to overcome and proceed through those challenges by recognizing the value in them and the opportunity, rather than just the overwhelming dread and and all the negatives that we typically focus on when we're being challenged. So that's interesting, and I think helpful to all of us wherever we are on the spectrum. And then the other is a book that is it's faith-based, and but what I really enjoy about it is, even if you subscribe to a different faith than the author, it's really about pushing us to step out and try and understand different people, which seems to be very important right now, and some cultural implications. So the book is by Kyle Idleman, Idleman, and it's called Not a Fan: Becoming a completely committed follower of Jesus. So if you're certainly in the Christian faith, that's an excellent book. Even if you're not, some of the principles really follow over from our awareness and understanding of other religions. So it's I encourage you to take a peek at that.
That's great, man. I'm definitely going to check out both books. I appreciate the challenges and both book recommendations for this week.
Yeah, thanks. That's fun.
All right. So to be honest, when I always like to research as much as I can for the guests, read about them, kind of understand who they are. and I was kind of drooling, reading over, some of the things that you've done and like what you're studying, and I just think it's really awesome, man. And I don't want to take any of your thunder away. I want you to be able to tell the listeners, but man, what a cool field you're in, and your work is very impressive. So could you give the listeners a background of maybe who you are and what you're working on today?
Yeah, so that could be, I'll be brief, and then I'll let you kind of guide how the conversation ends up on digging in on some of these topics. Generally speaking, I like to think about the work. All these things are kind of tied together that I'm involved in, and they all revolve around a fundamental principle about understanding how our physiological experience, so our body, our heart, our brain activity, contribute to the way that we think, feel, and behave. Ultimately, from an educational background, I've been trained in psychology and in specifically psychophysiology, or the application of how the body contributes to our overall experience. And what was really appealing about this, or really kind of grabbed me after having wandered through the university studying a bit of everything for an extensive amount of time, much to the chagrin of my parents who were paying tuition, I landed in psychology, and what hooked me about this particular aspect of it was there was something unique about different people's perception of the way they presented. So I thought it was very interesting that biologically there was something that showed up differently in neurological scans, whether neuroimaging techniques, that differed or differentiated people who were depressed from people who had anxiety, from people who had attention deficits, from people who had different severity of all those things, or maybe had acute or situational stressors. There was something that showed up in the neuroimaging that identified that marker, and that was really interesting to me, because a lot of the people that I had encountered in just life thought they behaved that way for some unknown reasons. It was fate, or it was just the way they were. So that was kind of interesting to be able to start to discriminate of what people might experience based off their body. But then even more powerful and interesting to me was that you could learn to regulate that. So just by doing simple types of techniques, either behaviors or operant conditioning or training, learning how to shift your physiology, you could change that entire presentation. So if a person was depressed or anxious or fill in any of those blanks, they didn't have to have that experience for the rest of their life if they didn't want to. And that's incredible that people can learn to shift their entire experience around. And so that took on a big journey, and was really exciting, and started the pursuits that I'm now involved in, both from an academic study as well as creating technologies and products that try to capture those moments. But then that set up the opportunity to start working in performance, and the applications around athletes or executives or performing artists. And really, we're all performers sometime, whether we're a stay-at-home parent or we're in the corporate world. There are those moments of performance. And so that started changing my entire paradigm around the way we think about symptom presentations and characteristics that generally tend to label us with some not so nice definitions, but instead reframe that into the opportunities, the strengths, and certainly identifying the opportunities for improvement for all of us, wherever we are on that spectrum. So largely, the whole pursuit, everything that we've been involved in, are researching and developing around helping individuals identify the physiological characteristics that contribute to their experience, and then tweaking it, enhancing it, changing it, so that they can maximize their success in whatever environment they're in.
Okay, so I'm going to peel this one piece at a time, and I really appreciate that breakdown. So to break it down, your whole goal is to get a better understanding of how basically the physiological relates to the psychological. Is that a fair statement?
I wouldn't say that's the whole goal, but it's a very primary component, is to understand, to what degree does our body and brain contribute to our experience. Absolutely.
And then to drill it down further, you go into high performance specifically, right?
Right.
And so, Oh, go ahead.
And taking that a step further of saying that high performance typically has been defined as people who are often on the pedestal or are on the podium as winners of Olympians or national championships, etc. And my premise is that in fact all of us, even if that's not our our venue to perform, have many of the same overlapping types of characteristics or features when we're being successful or not, as do those individuals. And there's certainly some things that make those individuals unique and something to aspire toward, but all of us have the capacity to refine and enhance where we currently are.
Okay, so if you wanted to take someone and get them to the high performance level, are you focusing on changing the physiology or the psychology?
Both.
Both.
And the physiology first. And so the analogy that many people can identify with is a physical one, where we say, I understand, let's say, use the game of golf as an example. I understand it very well. I can theorize it in my mind. I can watch it on television and know the proper play and all of those types of things. But I don't have the physical capacity. I don't have the biomechanics. I don't have the flexibility or the strength developed in order to execute any of the things that I have, academic knowledge about. So I have to go to the gym. I have to learn how to physically succeed. Then I have to apply the skill set. So much in the same context where an athlete who might have been coached really well or be really well educated on his position or her position and sport, they may not have the capacity physically to do it. And so we focus on strength and conditioning and biomechanics and all those types of things. And then we layer on top of it some really good coaching and skill development. Well, that's how I equate to our mental performance. We have this nervous system, this autonomic and central nervous system, which lays the foundation for our ability to employ some psychological principles or mental skills. And so oftentimes what we find is people who are really well equipped from an academic standpoint, they've been coached well, they've had great teachers, maybe they've even figured some things out on their own, but they still have this barrier to employing it or succeeding at very high levels because they haven't yet, developed the physical underlying components necessary in order to employ those techniques or strategies. So it's a two-pronged piece, and both are very important. We know plenty of people who physiologically, they're fine specimens of physical ability. And that's true for the mental side too. They have incredible brain power, but they don't have the skills or they don't have the coaching or those kinds of pieces. And there are people who are on the other side. So you really need both of those things.
Okay, that makes sense. And, I have a pretty decent understanding of physically training a human being. I mean, that's what I do for a living. So what are some, and we could touch on that some more, but I'm very interested in the psychological side of things. Like what skills, mental skills do you work on, or do you see people, elite performers having that maybe, other people who fall short, don't really have that, those skills?
Yeah, it's an excellent question and premise, and in fact, it sets up kind of the fundamental stages, I call it, of mental performance. So, to kind of break it down into bite-sized chunks, we basically think about it in 3 domains, and so I call this the first one. This is the way we feel. So like just our overall experience of things. Like I enjoy it, I dread it. I have what we colloquially refer to as anxiety. Like I feel anxious about performing or whatever the situation, or I feel joy and happiness about it. I call that our mind domain. So it's kind of like what we just bring to it from a mindset or emotional attributes. Then breaking it into the cognitive domain, and that's just how we perform skills like problem solving, decision making, those types of pieces. And then the last is this neural component, which is very physiological. Like, is our brain capable of doing the thing, or focusing intensely, or backing down from being overexcited or over engaged? So in each of those different domains, the one I really focus, I do a bit in all of them, but most of the research has been in, for me, in the neurological or the physical piece of it. But in all 3 of those categories, you have the opportunity to assess it and train it. And in that process of working on whichever of those domains you choose to kind of engage in, the thing that sets high performers apart is they have a large repertoire of brain states or abilities. So it's not like they just are highly motivated. That's a huge component, but that's not the only piece. There also has to be this ability to recover or understand the value of not being activated today. And it's not just about pushing strength and being in the gym every day. If we want to use a physical, like a muscular kind of analogy, you can exercise a muscle every day, but that's not the best routine for it. You need to have recovery time periods. So that applies also to our mental domains or our brain domains. So having a large repertoire of being able to do all of those things very effectively, and having a volitional control or the capacity to understand, for this environment, I need to kind of dial it down. That level of excitement or engagement for this particular event or this particular moment it needs to be dialed up or dialed down in order to be maximally successful. And understanding that what the environment is or what the requirement is, but then having the chance or the volitional control to do it. So if I go into an event and I'm really amped up and I recognize that I need to be more calm, going, I recognize I'm too amped up, but can I do anything about it? Can I internally adjust to match what's needed or not? So that's the volitional control piece. And then the third element is then to be able to intensify that. So sometimes if we use just basic concepts of managing our stressors or focusing, because they're pretty straightforward for people to kind of grab onto, to what degree do I need to be highly focused? Is this like a major concentration task, or is this one of those things where I just need to kind of attend to it and not overthink it and let my body execute the action rather than necessarily overdoing? So that understanding the degree of intensity that is required and adjusting that. So we want to be able to push harder, focus more intensely in this example, or back off from that more intensely. It's for recovery time. And then the fourth and final piece of that program would be to be in maintenance mode, where you understand those pieces. You're just keeping those skills sharp, either in an off season or during a recovery period or whatever the scenario is. So the differentiator from people who are very successful in their world, whatever that is they have lots of brain states. They're the capacity to have a large repertoire of things to do from a mental standpoint. They have the ability to control what they do rather than being controlled by their environment, and then they can intensify it or do it very strongly.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense. Now, is there a way to take someone like, say I'm only really operating at 80% of my potential? Is there a way to get me to that 20% of what you just said?
Yeah, so there's a way to improve it. I don't know, quantifying that 20% and seeing how close we get to what is capacity, and that's one of the fun things. I think one of the more exciting elements of what I get to really research and work with people is it's not like we know what your maximum capacity is. From a physical standpoint, we certainly know, if I have a certain, how the muscle behaves, what the fast twitch fibers are. I mean, we could kind of project what our maximum capacity might be, but we see people break those records or exceed what their physical capabilities were in moments of greatness. That's the same is true for mental stuff and brain performance. And it's even more challenging to predict because we don't know what capacity limits there are on our abilities to perform from an emotional or cognitive standpoint. So yes is the answer. We can certainly get closer to tapping into that, whatever that percentage is, 20, but maybe it is more than that. Maybe there's that little extra element that you bring to the situation where you can exceed even your own ideal 100%.
And what kind of do you do things like meditation? Like, what are some actual tactical stuff that people work on, or is this like a case by case basis? How does that work?
Yeah, so it depends on the individual and kind of what they're already great at doing or where their particular challenges are. So generally I find that, just finding where somebody is weak and, pulling that tool out of the bag and hammering on that particular weakness isn't always the best strategy. For sometimes it is. They're great and everything, but they just have one particular identified weakness where we need to improve, and we start dealing with it in whatever way. But that most of the time we want to utilize the things that we're really good at in order to help bring up our weaknesses. And so it might be like meditation, but if I teach you meditation techniques, or maybe you already understand it, and this is the case for most people, is they go, I think I have an understanding of what meditation is. It's just really boring, or I really have a hard time doing it, or it really frustrates me, or I'm busy, or fill in the blank with all the things that we tell ourselves when we say, I can't do that thing. Then it might be a better strategy to say, okay, that might be an end goal. But in the meanwhile, let's learn how to regulate our body, because it might be the physical piece of it that is the barrier to being a good meditator. So one of the tools that I might use in that case are biofeedback techniques, or neurofeedback, training the brainwave activity to be in a more calm state. And that allows us then to start employing the strategies of meditation, or a mindfulness practice, or something similar to that. And a lot of people kind of have like preconceived notions of what it is to meditate or to be mindful. And in reality, I think breaking some of those molds and not being so really dogmatic about how we approach some things, allowing some flexibility, allows us to kind of start somewhere and be successful and grow that practice, rather than having some high bar that prohibits us from being successful in it.
Another thing I read in preparing for this podcast was you study the brains of people who make decisions. And so is what we're talking about the same research of decision making, or is that a different field?
No, they're very much tied together, and that's one of the things that it kind of impresses me. The smarter I should be getting, so the more academic we become, the more we realize we don't know things. But the thing that really impresses me is how all of these things are connected together. So our capacity to be, to express gratitude and appreciation, for example, is a theme that you don't think has much to do with performance on a football field, as an example. But in reality, when looking at the people who are really great on a football field, a common theme that comes up is this capacity to have compassion or gratitude or appreciation. It's like, wow, how are those two things related? And we don't know to a large degree how that might shift people's thought patterns, or their thinking, or their ability to approach a scenario and be successful at it. But they're all tied together. So yes, understanding the people who make good decisions leads us not just down the path. I mean, in a very narrow sense of it, it's about cognitive skill sets. So why do they make good decisions? Is it reaction speed? Is it having been there before and now it's experience that teaches us? Is it coaching, like I trained them how to do things and they were able to recognize it and then just do what they had been taught? All of those things are very narrow definitions of making good decisions, and they're all important. But then there's this other element, these things that don't so narrowly fit the definition of what you might think of as being able to say, well, what makes you make a good decision? It's, strength of relationships, or capacity to forgive yourself if you make a mistake, or, kind of things that are almost, not really easily defined, or, out there a little bit, so to speak. It's interesting to me in the past few years, especially. One of the things so I'll go back, maybe like 5-6 years when I first started working a lot with high-performing athletes. One of the things that was really attractive about the work that I do is it's very quantitative in nature. Like I measure how the brain performs, and I can say, okay, here's your reaction speed. Here's how quickly you made that decision, and here's whether you were correct. Here's what happened to your brain after you made a mistake versus when you made the right decision. And we can define it, and it's very quantitative, and that feels very good because we can say, there's the number. Let me go work on it and see if that number improves, or it's very concrete. But what's interesting about it is the more that I've moved on, and we'll say in the past couple of years, it's more I've had an awareness or recognition that some of the things that were probably a little bit more squishy, is the word I like to use. It's a little bit more around the mind concepts play a role in those quantitative or objective metrics. So all of these things are all bundled together, and that's what I think is kind of fun, is kind of pulling out these different strings and seeing how they contribute to this bigger picture.
That just really coincides with just my idea. The reason for doing this podcast, it's called Better Humanology, but I really feel, and I feel like what you've explained, if I, give me just a minute for my own understanding, it'll help me if I explain it out. But, if we had a soundboard with 100 different dials on it, you're kind of saying, raising one is going to raise all of them. But to what degree you don't know, and you have to find which one of those sound dials to raise per person. And is that a good metaphor of breaking down, increasing someone's performance?
Right, and also to say that in some scenarios, in some venues, you might need to change the soundboard where you dial down a couple of the features and you dial up a couple of others, and you've got this master switch which brings everything up or down. But then you've got nuances within that of like, ooh, right now I need to really bring up a particular element and not kind of suppress something else, but then transition that to another area and reconfigure the soundboard. And that flexibility is really when we start to be our best, is when we have not only developed each of those features and characteristics through specific tools, but being able to identify, ooh, here's how I need to adjust the board in order to maximally, to sound my best in this particular venue, so to speak.
And I want to jump back to another thing you brought up. I follow Louis Simmons from Westside Barbell, a lot of his texts and stuff that he's put out. And, one of the things that we covered recently on the podcast, I just finished doing a year-long challenge where I did this really challenging workout once a week every Saturday. And one thing that I took from him when doing this was the fact that if I were to really increase, say, my mental intensity to a level 10 every Saturday, I would not have survived, because I just would have worn my body down over the course of time, and it just wouldn't have been good. And this is something that he recommends his athletes. He coaches some of the strongest men in the world, and so. But when I wanted to set a new personal record for myself, I had the ability to flip that intensity, bring that all the way up to a 10, and get it done. Now this is something that you brought up, and I find very interesting, because I don't know how it relates maybe to the central nervous system, or if it's just purely mental. Could you talk about that and maybe make sure that I understand it correctly, in the fact that, you said high performers have this ability to know when to dial it up a notch and when they just can kind of be in maintenance or whatever the case may be?
No, you nailed it exactly. In your description, you conceptually defined exactly the same thing that happens in the mental side of it. And there's two pieces to that mental side of it, or really the three pieces, but or those three different domains. But there's that, the physical contributor, and then the cognitive or emotional, or just the kind of mental, can define that as mental attribute of it, are very much similar in the way that you described. So where we do have to dial up some pieces of it. And so from a nervous system scenario, the brain is not a muscle, but it works analogous for us to think about training it in a particular way. So if I think about asking you to engage in a challenge task, you're solving problems, or you're doing some complex something, you not only develop the skill of being able to do that thing, you're also pushing and challenging your brain to create and strengthen neural networks. And that can't be underemphasized, or can't be overemphasized, about how valuable and important that is. And the basic things that we do to make that type of thing happen is exposure to different environments, really pushing ourselves to succeed at things that we're not good at as much as we do the things that we are good at, trying new things, getting different types of experiences. Because if we just do the same thing over and over, we develop a skill at doing that thing. But then once we develop the skill, our brain actually kind of takes a break. It's like, okay, I know how to do it. I don't need to really push that hard, and it's not as challenging. So we always want to be changing up our environment. And there's a kind of I don't want to call it a trend, that might be too strong of a word, but there's this notion that's happening in education about, the best ways to, if we had a child, would we sit them in a classroom and just throw knowledge at them for a month, or would we just take a month-long trip around the world and allow them to experience different languages and cultures and sites, and the latter of those would be much more enriching and good for their brain from a developmental standpoint than just throwing knowledge at them for a month. So creating this strong neural system, whether that's increased efficiency, increased networks and communication pathways, all those types of things, that's a huge component to learn to intensify that. But then there's that other piece of it, that mental side of it, where you do need, if you never push your boundary, you never make your boundary bigger. And that coincides very much with your analogy of saying, I need to turn it on to a 10. Well, you have to, one, have a 10, know where the 10 is, and then see if you've actually got an 11 or 12 in there, right? So you need to expand that range. And then what you find is that you're put into a scenario and you go, oh, this would have been really taxing for me before, but now it's not. It takes less effort because I've already increased that capacity. So yeah, very much the same idea of being able to dial it up or dial it down based on the environment or the need that's there. And so our capacity to expand that range adds value in our longevity as well as our ability to most efficiently perform, because when we can have more efficiency, it means we can now allocate resources to other attributes of the thing, of the, either the event or the sport or the, whatever the task is.
So are you a big advocate of like regularly learning new and challenging skills or experiencing new things and places?
Huge. I mean, if I could just spend, one of the things that I'm wanting to do some real research on, I anecdotally, kind of stumbled on it. I mean, again, it's happening a lot in education, but I've had this experience myself and heard other people talk about it. But I would love to do some real research around people who do a lot of either adventure types of skill development. I was very fortunate to work for a period and do some evaluations with my colleague Andy Walsh, who was a director of high performance at Red Bull North America, and he had a group of athletes and a group of Navy SEALs, and they were doing some collaborative exchange. And basically, we did a ton of evaluations in the beginning, and then they took them to South America and dropped them off in the mountains and said, we're going to go on this like 12-day adventure. And in that adventure were really physically demanding things, but there were also very challenging mental components to, experiencing very cold weather and very long days, and what happens when you get hungry, and all plus the group dynamic. I mean, there was just so many pieces to it, and then coming back and doing some evaluation about what changed in them from a physical and emotional and mental standpoint. And so those types of experiences, we need to have more data around that, but just anecdotally, people saying this completely shifted my paradigm about what the meaning of life is, or what the value proposition is for me, and what I have to offer the world, and all those kinds of things. And we see that happening whether it's that kind of a scenario or whether it's an adult person who for the first time has been exposed to a different culture, and then says, wow, that really changed the way that I need to interact with the people around me and how I conduct myself and the stressors that they experience. So yeah, I'm a huge advocate and think that probably has a more profound effect than we have been able to quantify to date. And I'm really excited about kind of pursuing that in the future years.
And that's really, I mean, that's just good to hear, but I'd like to know, what do you think? Let's just say break it down to the average Joe. What would you recommend that if he had to start doing something next week, like what's a small recommendation you could give to because I don't know, it could be extremely simple. I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question. So what's something that, to start practicing these skills we could do right away?
So I think this is, it is easy. It doesn't have to be a grand challenge. You don't have to make a month-long adventure and go someplace exotic and spend a ton of money and time and all those things. You can do something as simple as put yourself in any situation that is slightly uncomfortable. And by uncomfortable, I don't mean things that are like dangerous or strange or, exotic. I mean, go to a place that you typically wouldn't go, whether that's go have a meal at at a new place. Get off your street corner and go to a different street corner. It can be really basic. Go to, if you're into movies, go see a film that's not in the genre that you typically enjoy, but don't go do it in order to be kind of resentful towards having to do something different, but go into it saying, what can I learn about this different genre of film? Or what can I learn about this different group of people? Or what can I learn from, volunteering at a kids playground? Or, I mean, fill in the blank, doing something that just expands what you typically do. And again, it could be super simple, like eating at a different restaurant, or it could be something very challenging and emotionally, push you in a new way by saying, okay, I'm going to get involved with a culture or a group or a philanthropic mission that maybe is something that I normally wouldn't do or don't necessarily agree with. Just being exposed to something. So it could be really straightforward. One of the things that I like to do when it's, recommend for people to do is just pick a place, like kind of put a pin in the map and say, okay, I've got the day off, or I'm going to take half a day to dedicate to this experience or development of myself. Drop a pin on the map and say, I'm going to go to the, whatever the place is. It's a 30-minute drive or a long walk or whatever the situation, and say, I'm going to go there and I'm just going to hang out and observe for a little while. And just literally sitting and being present and understanding and watching the people or watching the events that occur changes the way our brain takes in that information and the perceptions we have. Some of those experiences are going to be incredibly rewarding. Some of them you'll walk away going, I don't think I got much out of that. But then it creeps up on you at a future event and you're like, oh, wow, I actually am more familiar with something now because I had that moment or that experience that I spent that half day and, eating in a different place or whatever the situation is. So just do something different. That's the point. Make a weekly goal to do something different, and that will cause you to think and feel and behave differently from that experience.
That's a real eye-opener for me. I think kind of retrospectively looking at my life. So when I was in the military previous to doing this that I'm doing full-time now, and they keep you very engaged with different experiences and things to do. There's no lack of new places, new experience and whatnot. And then once I got out and was working for myself and working from home, I almost saw that side of me atrophy, and I didn't realize it till after the fact. Was I could, because I work out at home, I work at home, my kids are at home. If someone comes to train with me, they come over to my house, we train in my garage. So it's just it's very much, this was like post-military. I didn't want to go anywhere because I had been everywhere. I was like, okay, I didn't leave the house for probably a month. And then once I went back out just into normal society, you call it, I could tell there's almost this different feeling, anxiety, almost like I was being pushed mentally just by doing something very mundane or normal, should I say. So I think I've seen the reverse work. If you don't push yourself, that will atrophy or go away.
Yeah.
All right,
very much.
I'm going to shift gears on you here. This is a question we like to ask every guest we get these days. So say there's a nationwide curriculum implemented, and the president calls you up and he says that you are responsible for one chapter of this book that they're going to be putting out. And so every single child in America, they're going to have to read your chapter and be tested on and pass before they're allowed to graduate high school and pursue further education. What would your chapter be about?
What would they be most likely to ask me about, or what would I want it to be?
Yeah, what would you want your chapter to be about?
Yeah, that is a really yeah, that's a great question. So I think the chapter would be something to the nature of, you aren't now what you will always be or have to be, and even though I try, or I don't try, but I have been very much involved in the quantitative elements, the kind of the science side of it, the neurons of it, that are tangible things you can touch and prod and poke. They this idea that even at that level, you are more than just that, and what you are given is not necessarily all that you have to be. So I think putting that into the context, the chapter would probably be a reflection of education around neuroplasticity and malleability, and what those implications would be for our overall experience and how we experience ourselves and others.
That's great. And so neuroplasticity, that is a very fascinating concept to me. And I think that's a lot of kind of what we were just discussing as far as new neural networks by experiencing new things. But how do you feel about the smaller things? I've done a very small amount of research on it from, there are a ton of apps out there with brain games to things like juggling, which is obviously learning a new skill, which we kind of discussed, but also things like brushing your teeth with your left hand. How do you feel? And I kind of want to know more about the apps on the phones. Do you think that those are useful, or do you think that it's not really necessary?
So to some degree, yes, they're very useful. Basically, the novelty factor is valuable, but it depends on what we expect our goal to be from the particular thing, whatever it is. So it's a tough question to answer unless we get really specific about the different nuances of it. So for example, if we're speaking about like playing a game that's supposed to enhance cognitive function, the research says that, yeah, that can be helpful as it applies to that specific skill. So there was a game that we used to play as kids, and I can't remember what it was called, but basically there were these cards and they had faces on them, and you turned them all over and you kind of flipped them over, and you could turn over 2 cards, and if they matched, great, you got to keep that pair, and if they didn't match, you had to remember what you saw and where it was. Well, that skill is very good to develop in your short-term memory and your ability to do those things, but it's only going to be helpful in the context of that particular type of skill. So I put my car keys down and I go, gee, where did I put them? If I've been playing that game for a week, I might remember where my car keys are to some degree, but may not translate into something very meaningful in my life on a grander scale. And so that's the real challenge, is how do we spend enough time doing these types of things so that we can really extract the value from them, but at the same time not put so much effort into things that don't generalize into bigger aspects of what's really going to positively impact our life and other types of things. So generally speaking, yes, it's great. It's especially if they're novel types of things. And I would encourage people who, it's better than, sitting and, scrolling through a ton of junk social media, but it might, we want to be aware of, what am I doing right now, and what is my expectation around that thing right now? So if it's for fun and entertainment, yeah, absolutely, much better than some of the other things that we could do with our time. But we don't want to say that this is going to be the thing that keeps us from having degenerative aging in our brain. That's not going to be the solution for it. So staying active and being involved in those types of things to the degree to which people find it valuable, great. To the degree that you set appropriate goals for it. But there's a whole host of new opportunities around, employing mobile technologies and apps that do things that are more long-term valuable. Certainly we're tracking like our fitness levels, where our movements and steps and what we're eating, and, a gamification of all of these types of things. And I'm very much a believer in this idea of, if we utilize those tools to help us get smarter about our behaviors and what the resultant outcomes are from those behaviors, that's a great thing. So I'm by no means suggesting that these things aren't valuable to us, or that engaging in them isn't a good thing. It is. We just have to kind of temper our expectations. This is probably not going to cure Alzheimer's, but could it be helpful in your short-term memory? And yeah, potentially. But it will soon, the research indicates anyway, that will soon plateau and have, once you maximize the potential, it's maximized. So we just want to be mindful about that.
Okay, so the games kind of make you better at the games, but that does have some positive positive benefit. Is there a more general neuroplasticity practice that you would recommend, or is that getting out and experiencing things like we've discussed?
Yeah, I think there's a combination. So, certainly, doing self-regulation techniques, and that can be something that's mechanical and app-oriented, like biofeedback or neurofeedback. That can be something that is very experiential, like getting out and doing things, learning languages, meeting different people, and that can be very physical also. Nutrition and physical exercise, all of those things are very strong players in our ability to create increased brain health. So all of the pieces, this is the one component where, all of the little attributes, all of the things that generally overwhelm us, which is why people often throw up their hands and say, I'm not going to do anything because I don't know what works or what doesn't work. All of those things have a contribution to this bigger picture of increasing our brain health. So what we eat, how we exercise, how we think, what we do with our time, how we spend our time, all of those things are important, and it can get hard to manage. And so I think largely people just say, I can't keep up with it all. I can't be smart about it. Just forget it. And then they just go on with their life and choose not to do anything.
That's what I see happen in nutrition all the time. When I talk to people about, they're like, well, I've heard about paleo, I heard about going vegan and counting macros and all this stuff, and they get overwhelmed with information. And so instead of picking one and going that route, which would, in all honesty, be better than anything else they could do, and I don't really care which one you pick, they decide just to do nothing and stay where they're at, and that's the worst thing that they could have done.
It's the same in mental performance too. We just get stagnant. We go, and because it takes effort, and if it were easy, everybody would do it, so to speak. But a lot of the times we overcomplicate it on our own, just by trying to really get enthusiastic. And so, the kind of the takeaway from that is temper our expectations, but also temper our ability. What we feel like we have to do. Doing something is better than doing nothing.
All right, I have a few more questions, but one I want to ask, especially someone of your caliber. Is there something that I should have asked you that I haven't asked you?
Oh, wow. No, I don't think so. I think generally speaking, depends on, there are things that could have been asked, but I don't think there's anything that should have been asked. No, it's, I've kind of enjoyed the opportunity to kind of expand on. Typically, I get asked very concrete types of things, and this has been fun to be able to say not only are these little neurons involved in some very specific functions, but also they contribute to this notion, this philosophical notion that, the sum is bigger than all the parts, and that's kind of fun, and I appreciate that chance to kind of convey that.
That's awesome. All right, I'm going to ask just a few more quick questions, and then we will wrap it up. So,
all right,
the quickfire questions of the show. What is the hardest workout or physical challenge you've ever brought upon yourself?
I decided I was going to run a couple of marathons, and I had come from a world of cycling in college. I had cycled and done endurance cycling for a bit, and so switching to running was challenging, and pushing through that wall, the proverbial wall that everybody talks about that's around mile 24, 25. And digging deep. That was the hardest physical thing, the biggest, most physical challenging thing I've ever done.
And in your opinion, what's the best activity for building mental toughness?
Yeah, I think mental toughness really is, if you define that as your capacity to embrace and deal with things, challenging things, it's about bring on challenge. Oftentimes we get into a mindset of I don't want to be challenged. We want to have successful lives. We want to have financial security. We want to be easy to do tasks and skills, and we often find ourselves doing things that are easy for us to do because we're good at it, or just because it's easy. And I would say, find something that's challenging. Don't just do what you can do. Embrace the things that you can't do on purpose, with intention, in order to create toughness. You won't be tough, if physically or mentally, if you never push yourself to do anything. So I think we get complacent, or we just, life itself sometimes can be so challenging that we don't try to push ourselves in other ways. And I say just do something, push, embrace challenge rather than avoid it.
Awesome, I love that. All right, here's the question of the show every guest gets. what is your best advice you have for becoming a better human? And this is 100% open-ended.
So, ask me again in a year, I might have a different answer, but right now, I think maybe because of the cultural situation, the kind of the tone that's happening, both either in politics as well as other types of venues, I think it's really about, I'll use the word tolerance, but it's really about finding the best in every person, both ourselves, starting there and saying, what is great about me? And we all have something that is great about us. Offering that greatness back to the world, and then looking for the greatness in others. Maybe it's helping them find it, but at least recognizing the value and the opportunity in each other, no matter what our differences might be.
Well, I really appreciate that. Now, I know some of the listeners are probably very interested in learning more about you or some of your work. Is there a place that they could go to check that stuff out and learn more?
Yeah, so I keep my personal website, which is lesliesherlin.com, always updated with various things and links that can go to other fun exploits that I enjoy doing, so both academically and professionally, as well as kind of hobbies.
Okay, perfect. And I will put that in the show notes when we publish this. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate your time.
I absolutely appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Your best. Losers always whine about their best.